Part 3 for the conclusion. To repeat, there were sounds occasioned by the artist in prying open the oblong box by means of a chisel and mallet, the latter being apparently muffled or deadened by some soft woolen or cotton substance in which his head was enveloped. In this matter, I fancied I could distinguish the precise moment when he fairly disengaged the lid also, and I could determine when he removed it altogether and when he deposited it upon the lower berth in his room. This latter point I knew, for example, by certain slight taps in which a lid made it striking against the wooded edges of the berth, as he endeavored to lay it down very gently, there being no room for it on the floor. After this there was a dead stillness, and I heard nothing more, upon either occasion, until nearly daybreak, unless perhaps I may mention a low sobbing or murmuring sound, which was so very suppressed as to nearly be inaudible, if indeed the whole of this latter noise were not rather produced by its own imagination. I say it seemed to resemble sobbing or sighing, but of course it could not have been either. I rather think it was a ringing in my own ears. This is why Mr. White, no doubt, according to custom, was merely given the rein to one of his hobbies, indulged in one of his fits of artistic enthusiasm. He had opened his oblong box in order to feast his eyes on the pictorial treasure within. There was nothing in this, however, to make him sob. I repeat, therefore, that it must have been simply a freak of my own fancy, distempered by good Captain Hardy's green tea. Just before dawn, on each side of the two nights of which I speak, I distinctly heard Mr. White replace the lid upon the oblong box, and force the nails into their old places by means of the muffled mallet. Having done this, he issued from his stateroom fully dressed, and proceeded to call Mrs. W. from hers. We had been at sea 7 days, and we were now off Cape Hatteras, when there became a tremendously heavy blow from the southwest. We were, in a measure, prepared for it. However, as the weather had been holding out threats for some time, everything was made snug, and aloft, and as the wind steadily freshened, we lay to at length under spanker and fore topsail, but both double reef. And as the wind steadily we lay to at length under spanker and that's it. In this trim we rode safely enough for 48 hours, the ship providing herself an excellent sea boat in many respects, and shipping no water of any consequence. At the end of this period, however, the gale had freshened into a hurricane, and after our sails split into ribbons, bringing us so much into the trough of the water that we shipped several prestigious seas, one immediately after the other. By this accident we lost 3 men overboard with the caboose, and nearly the whole of the larboard bulwarks. Scarcely we had recovered our senses, but before the fore topsail went into shreds, and we got up a storm staysail, and with this we did pretty well for some hours, the ship heading the sea much more steadily than before. A little confusing. The gale still held on, however, and we saw no signs of its abating. The rigging was found to be ill-fitted and greatly strained, and on the third day of the blow, about 5 in the afternoon, our mizzenmast, in a heavy lurch to windward, went by the board. For an hour or more we tried in vain to get rid of it on account of the prestigious rolling of the ship, and before we had succeeded, the carpenter came aft and announced 4 feet of water in the hold. To add to our dilemma, we found the pumps choked and nearly useless. All was now confusion and despair, but an effort was made to lighten the ship by throwing overboard as much of the cargo as could be reached, and by cutting away 2 masts that remained. This we at last accomplished, but we were still unable to do anything at the pumps, and in the meantime the leak gained on us very fast. At sundown the gale had sensibly diminished in violence, and as the sea went down with it, we still entertained faint hopes of saving ourselves in the boats. At 8 p.m. the clouds broke way to the windward, and we had full advantage of a full moon, a piece of good fortune which served wonderfully to cheer our dropping spirits. After incredible labor, we succeeded at length in getting the longboat over the side without material accident, and into this we crowded the whole of the crew and most of the passengers. This party made off immediately, and undergoing much suffering, finally arrived in safety at Ocracoke Inlet on the third day of the wreck. 14 passengers with captain remained on board, resolving to trust their fortunes to the jolly boat at the stern. We lowered it without difficulty, although it was only by miracle that we prevented it from swamping as it touched the water. It contained, when afloat, the captain and his wife, Mr. Wyatt and party, a Mexican officer, wife, 4 children, and myself with a valet. We had no room, of course, for anything except a few positively necessary instruments, some provisions, and the clothes upon our backs. No one had thought of even attempting to save anything more. What must have been the astonishment of all then, when, having proceeded a few fathoms from the ship, Mr. Wyatt stood up in the stern sheets and coolly demanded of Captain Hardy that the boat should be put back on the purpose of taking in his oblong box. "Sit down, Mr. Wyatt," yelled the captain somewhat sternly. "You will capsize us if you do not sit quite still. Our gunwale is almost in the water now." "The box!" vociferated Mr. Wyatt, still standing. "The box, I say, Captain Hardy. You cannot and you will not refuse me. Its weight will be but a trifle. It is nothing, mere nothing, but by the mother who bore you, for the love of heaven, by your hope of salvation, I implore you to go back for the box." The captain for a minute seemed touched by the earnest appeal by the artist, but then regained his stern composure and merely said, "Mr. Wyatt, you are mad. I cannot listen to you. Sit down, I say, or you will swamp the boat. Stay, hold him, seize him. He is about to spring overboard. There, I knew it. He is over." As the captain said this, Mr. Wyatt, in fact, sprang from the boat, and as we were yet to see the lee of the wreck, succeeded, by almost superhuman exertion, in getting hold of a rope which hung from the forechains. That was exciting. In another moment he was on board, rushing frantically down into the cabin. In the meantime, we had been swept astern of the ship, and being quite out of her lee, were at the mercy of a tremendous sea which was still running. We made a determined effort to put back, but our little boat was like a feather in the breath of a tempest. We saw at a glance that the doomed unfortunate artist was sealed. As our distance from the wreck rapidly increased, the madman, for so only we could such regard him, was seen to emerge from the companionway, in which by dint of strength that appeared gigantic, he dragged bodily the oblong box. While we gazed in the extremity of astonishment, he passed rapidly several turns of a 3-inch rope around the box and then around his body. In another instant, both body and box were in the sea, disappearing suddenly and at once forever. We lingered a while, sadly, upon our oars, with our eyes riveted upon the spot. At length we pulled away. The silence remained unbroken for an hour. Finally, I hazarded a remark. "Did you observe, Captain, how suddenly they sank? Was that not an exceedingly singular thing? I confess that I entertained some feeble hope of his final advance when I saw him lash to the box and commit himself to the sea." "They sank as a matter of course," said the captain, "and like that shot they will soon rise again. However, not till the salt melts." "The salt!" I ejaculated. "Hush!" said the captain, pointing to the wife and sisters of the deceased. "We mustn't talk of these things at an appropriate time. At a more appropriate time. We suffered much, made narrow escape, but fortune befriended us, and as well as our mates in the longboat. We landed in fine, more dead than alive, after 4 days of intense distress, upon the beach opposite Roanoke Island. We remained here a week, but not ill-treated by the records, and at the length obtained a passage to New York. About a month after the loss of independence, oh no, speaking of, about a month after the loss of independence, I happened to meet Captain Hardy in Broadway. Our conversation turned naturally upon the disaster, and especially upon the sad fate of poor Wyatt. I thus learned the following particular. The artist had engaged passage for himself, wife, two sisters, and a servant. His wife was indeed, as she had been represented, a most lovely and most accomplished woman. On the morning of the 14th of June, the day which I had first visited the ship, the lady suddenly sickened and died. The young husband was frantic with grief, but circumstance imperatively forbade the deferring of his voyage to New York. It was necessary to take her mother the corpse of his adorned wife, and on the other hand, the universal prejudice with which would prevent his doing so openly was well known. 9/10 of the passengers would have abandoned the ship rather than take passage with a dead body. In this dilemma, Captain Hardy arranged that the corpse, being first partially embalmed and packed with a large quantity of salt in a box of suitable dimensions, should be conveyed on board as merchandise. Nothing to be said of the lady's decease, and, as it was well understood that Mr. Wyatt has engaged passage for his wife, it became necessary that some person should personate her during the voyage. This a deceased lady's maid was easily prevailed to do. The extra straight stateroom, originally engaged for this girl during her mistress's life, was now merely retained. In the stateroom, the pseudo-wife slept, of course, every night. In the daytime, she performed to the best of her ability the part of her mistress, whose person had been carefully ascertained was unknown to any of the passengers on board. My own mistake arose, naturally enough, through too careless, too inquisitive, and too impulsive a temperament. But of late it is a rare thing that I sleep soundly at night. There is a countenance which haunts me, turn as I will. There is a hysterical laugh which will forever ring in my ear. And Alan Poe's The Oblong Box. Thanks for hanging out.